We're going to continue on with our 3D camera work. Here, this image that we see in composition 2 called moving photos is going to help us really get a good grasp of what we can do to bring in more perhaps impact, excitement, interest into potentially rather boring or just not very dynamic images, like a still photograph. And we see this a lot in documentaries. We see it a lot in opening title credits for TV and movies. And it's relatively simple. It does take some care, though. This is a photograph that has been broken down into 2 layers. And if I was to look at the original photograph by itself, I'm not really going to see all of it. Maybe I can double click on it here. The original photograph looks something about like this. Actually, no, it looks just like this. And what we've done is we've cut out the foreground bodies from the background part of this dump. So all of this large pile of trash and the people picking through it are all on one layer, and then the layer behind it is another layer. But you can't just cut it out in Photoshop and then hope to move forward with it. What you need to do is you need to do things like patch using the clone stamp tool or the content aware filler. You have to paint in quite a bit of information in order for us to have the mobility to, let's go, well, now let's look at this one now, to allow the parallax movement of the camera moving through a space like this to not end up seeing repeats of the same figures. It'd be really weird if we're moving through space and you're like, wow, this is very real, and you're like, wait a minute, that guy's flattened onto the background as well as being a foreground moving element. So the painting that goes on here is quite visible with the background layer. So that care has already been done. See, there we can see it up close. That's how much repainting had to be done. And with something like that, that's a background that is rather chaotic and doesn't have a whole lot of repeating, you don't have to be too awesome with your stamp. You can get away with some repeated patterns, but you got to be careful when you get into touch-up work like that, because we do recognize patterns as smart human beings, and we could call you out on it rather quickly. So it also has a barbed wire, which we're not going to see here. We have a dirt cloud with some dirt. We have scratches of 2 different layers. And so the scratches in the dirt are for atmospheric effect. You'll really get to understand what I'm talking about once we see it in action. The barbed wire is just something brought in to provide an even closer foreground element for us. Since we only have 2 that came out of this photograph, it's nice to have a 3rd outside element just to give us even more sense of movement. So what I want you to do is I want you to work on the background image first. Background image, I was solo. I hit the little button that is in the solo column. It hides everything else and just lets me look at the original layer. I'm going to take scale and I'm going to scale it down so that I am roughly looking at this thing without seeing those edges. Okay, so there's the scale change of the original. Now let me use this as a basis now for the rest of my movements. Not even movements, but positioning and orientation of these other layers. So if I solo my background layer, it takes over the visual dominance of the screen, and I no longer see my background. So just for temporarily, I'm going to select that back layer. I'm just going to lower its opacity slightly until I really get a feel for how this thing is going to line up the way I want it to. So if we're working in 3D and using cameras and all that stuff, we know that we need a 3D layer. In fact, I should just do that for all of them right now. So I'm going to use position, and I'm going to go to my Z, and I'm going to start dragging that thing back in space pretty far until I feel like it's just lined up. I don't have double vision anymore, which would be approximately right here. It doesn't have to be perfect because that background layer is going to be totally gone once we compile all this. So that layer is good. I'm going to use my opacity and take it back to 100% so it doesn't burn me later. And then I'm going to use the solo switch for my my front layer. I'm going to again use position, and I'm going to scale it back. Well, I need to look at the position of my background layer too. My background layer went back pretty far. It went back almost 2,000 pixels in Z. I don't want to go that far with my front layer. I'd like to go maybe halfway. So if I'm talking about 2,000, I'll just take this to about 1,000. And what we've noticed is that it's bigger and not quite where it needs to be. So that is going to be a scale change, because if I keep going back, I'll eventually be in alignment with the image, but I won't have any depth going on. So this foreground image, I want it to be a lot closer to us. So I'm going to hold down Shift and hit S so I can see both position and scale. I'm going to start scaling it down. I'm going to unsolo the background layer. That'll help. I'm pretty darn close. Somewhere right around 74, maybe a little bit under. That's good. I just need to move it up now. So now I can move it up, and it's right about where it needs to be. I'm going to unsolo those layers and then just take the background off. I don't need it anymore. It's served its purpose. So if I zoom out a little bit, what we should start to see is that the background and the front layer should get relatively close to being about the same scale. It's not quite. So I suppose I could go into my front layer and take it down and scale just a bit more so that they are the same width. That's all I'm looking for. It's a relative deal there. So now what I want to do before I get into the scratches and the barbed wire is just kind of feel this thing out. I want to bring in a camera. So I'll go to Layer, New, Camera, and I can just leave it called Camera 1. But I'm going to do something different this time with this camera. The last camera we used, it was a 2-node camera, which means it has position and point of interest. And I talked about point of interest being helpful, and I also talked about how it can kind of get in the way. So if we change our camera mode to a 1-node camera, that means there is no point of interest. The camera just moves through space without having the need to point it at anything. If you need to have it look like it's pointed to something, you could just use one of the rotation or orientation features of the camera. So no depth of field, 50 millimeters, and here is my camera. If I open up position now, and I just start playing with my Z value, you'll get a quick feel for that relationship, that spatial relationship of the people in the foreground and that element in the background. I'm not real wild about the closeness and proximity, so I'm going to go to my background layer, I'm going to open up position and scale, and I'm going to push it back even further. I'm going to go probably to like 3,000. I'm holding down Shift while I drag, and then I have to scale it up so that it's back to about that same width as the front layer. So boom, right around there. So the reason I can scale it up above 100% is because we've pushed it back and it got smaller. So there's an interesting relationship with depth and scale of these bitmap or raster images, because you would never take an image and make it go above 100% if it's at 100% scale already. And now, with this whole idea of 3D space, when you push something back, it gets smaller and gives you the flexibility to make it bigger again without exceeding its sort of natural state. So now, my camera movement, if I move closer, it's much of a greater difference of parallax movement between the foreground and the background subject. You can see it even better if you track from left to right, okay, or did a little bit of up and down. It's almost like you're starting to see behind them, which you just can't do in photographs. But we are illusionists, and we can do that because we're super powered digital heroes. So there's just the camera. I'm just going to leave it where it was. Now I'll address the barbed wire and the dirt and such. I'm going to have to zoom out a little bit to actually see it. But the barbed wire, there it is, up in like full proximity. I'm going to open position, and I'm going to push it back a little bit. I don't know. You know what? I'm just going to leave it where it is. I'm just going to address scale. I'm just going to scale it down because I want something in the foreground, so I shouldn't push it too far back. So I'll just kind of like leave it like right down here. And then we have this dirt cloud that we need to address. I'm just going to kind of pull it up so it's in view here in sort of the center. You can see it. You can see all that nice dirt. It's awesome. So if I hit position there, and I want to maybe have that dirt be, you know, perhaps somewhere between the barbed wire and the front layer. I can just look at the positions. The barbed wire is basically at 0, and the front layer is at 1,000. So maybe the dirt cloud is going to be at like 400, maybe something like that. Not so much. And then I'll scale it down too, just to make sure it's nice and visible. The scratches, number 1, I'm going to hit position. I'd like some scratches real close to the camera, so I'll go -Z and I'll bring them up close. Okay, and I'll also need to change scale on that just so that we're not too zoomed into that layer. Whoa, I'm going bigger. I'm going to go smaller, Greg, smaller. And you know, the nice thing about scaling it down is that you know that you're pushing in, so you're not going to see any edges of any of that stuff, because we're basically, with the camera pushing into the shot, it means you're enlarging all of these things. So scratches number 2, the position of these things, let's put them, I don't know, how about like between the people and the background. So that means it's going to have to be somewhere around like 2,000. So somewhere around here. Now, let's zoom back in again, this camera, as it moves through, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keyframe this. I'm going to start my frame 0 right there, and then I'm going to push in. And I might pan up a little bit so I can kind of get that guy in the background, but you can only go so far before you start to see evidence of your patch-up work. So now if we watch this, the camera is moving through not just the photo, but we've created and broken apart the essence of this scene, which is very dirty and dusty and gritty. So that dirt cloud, those dust flakes and all that end up being an actor or a performer in this three-dimensional scene, and it helps enhance the aesthetic and feeling and vibe of the shot. But the fact that we actually get to see more of the scene than the photograph originally intended is really magical. It puts us in this moment. We get to actually like get a feeling that we're almost there, magically teleported through the screen, you know, into this. So here we go. Like, look at that. Oh, it's so cool. The dust particles up front, you know, the barbed wire moving at a greater rate than the people because it's closer in proximity to us. And we see the revealing of the dump behind us. There's other dirt and grit and things like that that are really rather fascinating. So this becomes not only just an exercise in the camera, but more of like, think about what you can do with your components. Now, this doesn't have to be an old-timey photo. It could be a new photo. It could be illustrations, right? You could have an illustration that you break up into multiple planes like this and set it up. As long as perspective and scale and all of that seem to be adequate and consistent, then when you bring a camera in, we can move through that scene. So this camera could move, maybe it jogs to the right a little bit, So we, come on, update. We push in, kind of go over to the right, and then we level out and come back up. Who knows? The camera can kind of fly around. If we want to see the camera at a better angle, maybe we just change our view to the top. And we zoom out and we see, all right, there's the path that's going on here. If that helps, great. Maybe you need to look at it from the right view and think about not only just a forward movement, but maybe something needs to happen with a vertical shift. And then again, obviously, you could look at it through several views and get yourself looking at your results as you move the camera through the space. So, the real magic on this one, it definitely is the photograph and all of the construction of those layers and organizing them in space. But we did learn that the camera, one node camera, does eliminate that point of view and is rather fascinating. Now, the last thing that we could look at is something like enabling depth of field. So, all I did here was double click on the camera layer and it opens back up. So if I choose enable depth of field, now I'm just going to stay in this double view here. The options for the camera, you can see depth of field is on, my focus distance hasn't changed, my aperture level, and so on. So the focus distance is the end of that triangle. So that distance I could shorten and put it to the what is that layer? That layer must be, whoops, the dust. Is that what it is? No, it's the barbed wire. So where is my front? Oh, it's way back there. Let's zoom out even more. So here's the camera, focus distance. I can extend it to that layer that is the people. And now if I was to increase my aperture, look what happens to the master image. I'm just going to come back to one view, zoom in. That means that anything that's not in the range of that focus point will be more out of focus, because we know the higher the aperture we go on the camera, any camera, physical camera, the greater depth of field we have depending on our lens and whatnot. You can also cheat this by increasing your blur level, and it'll blur it even more and kind of fuzz it out. So now my background's definitely fuzzy, my foreground is in focus, but that's just at this moment in time. If I come back to the very beginning here, then nothing's really in focus. That is because if I go back to my two views, I look at where my focus point is, it's not on those people anymore. So I might want to keyframe that and make sure that it is set to the position of, I'm going to get rid of that middle keyframe so I have just two to work with. So it's set to be in focus right at, I'm just nudging it now so I can guarantee that I'm on it. So we're starting off, these guys are in focus, everything else is out of focus, and then as we move through this scene, and we've pushed in quite a bit, if I zoom out, nope, wrong one, this one, zoom out to reveal my background layer right here. Now I will push that focus, all the way back to that layer. And what happens It's so freaking cool, is that our focus is changed from the foreground to the background over time, which is also something that just breaks the laws of photography. Couldn't do that in a photo. So now we go from the people who are picking on the mountain of dirt to the guy back here who's just standing there watching. Maybe he's taking a break. Maybe he's waiting to see who scores what, knock him over the head with the board, and take it for himself. I don't know. But that focus with the camera is absolutely outstanding. But maybe one more trick, not a trick, but just a thought. Maybe I want to keep those people in focus until right around 3 seconds. So I'd have to make sure that I keep that focus keyframed back to one view so that they will be in focus all throughout this whole push, this journey forward. And then from 3 seconds to 5, the focus changes into the background. And now I'm starting to tell a whole new story with the same photo just by manipulating the camera. The other things I can keyframe would be my aperture and my blur level, so that maybe that doesn't happen until later, and I keep my blur level set to 100, and I'm going to reset my aperture to 25, and I start off with everything being in focus. My aperture is lowered, but then as we move through, the camera begins to center its attention on the people, and by 3 seconds that's where our attention is held, and then over the next 2 seconds it shifts into the focus of that guy in the background. Pretty cool stuff. So that's taking the camera a little bit further, thinking about layers a little bit more, dressing up our environments and our worlds, and creating some pretty unique moments to share with the people that we consider our audience. All right, thank you.